participated in. There'll be just a little message pops up on your screen saying that this meeting is being recorded, and you can acknowledge that you have seen that. Okay. Today for the presenters, just a quick introduction. We have myself, I'm Karen Plater, Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Planned Giving. Maggie Lewin, the Gifts Administrator at the Presbyterian Church in Canada, is here, and she's monitoring the question and answers and will help facilitate us in the discussion. And we have Mike Wood Daly, who is a special guest coming to us from Sephara Research. And we really appreciate him giving his time and discussing this interesting data, I think, that you will find. I know we have presented it already to the Life and Mission Agency, as well as there was a brief presentation to Assembly Council by Ian of some of the results, but this is, you're the next step in our sharing of these results, and we're going to take your feedback and your questions, and then we're going to prepare some reports to send both to presbyteries as well as to congregations so that you can look at this there. All right, this is part of the work that the Life and Mission Agency does in equipping congregations in a number of skills and providing tools for Presbyterian congregations, which is funded by your Gifts to Presbyterian Sharing. Thank you for all of your support. We will start by acknowledging that congregations across Canada are on the traditional territories of various Indigenous peoples. The Presbyterian Church in Canada's national offices are on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Petun, Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit Indigenous peoples. And that together we are on a journey of healing and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Just a few instructions. We'll ask you to stay muted during the presentation, and this is fantastic. I don't hear any background noise right now, so that is great. We're doing a new thing. This is Maggie and I are just learning this year, that we are going to use the Q&A toggle button for asking your questions. This allows us to monitor the questions a little easier and to mark them once they have been answered. But it means that you won't see all of the questions that people are asking in the Q&A. So if a question pops into your head, just put your question there in the Q&A. If you want to use chat, we have left chat enabled, but it would be more just a comment that you wanted others to see, or if there was something there. If we will look at the chat at the very end to see if any questions went in there by mistake, but if you wanted your question to be responded to, definitely put it in the Q&A. And then at the very end, we will also unmute so that those who are by phone or who want to express or explain something will be able to unmute themselves and do that. If you can raise your hand to show that you want to speak, that'll just help us to call on you. All right, great. So we look forward now to beginning. Oh yes, and also the recording as well as any slides and notes, and the slides will be posted at presbyterian.ca/leadership webinars. Look under the stewardship section. And once it's all posted, we will send an email out to all congregations and treasurers and finance to let them know that this is now posted online. And I think that you'll really like having the slides posted there, because Mike's going to go over some charts that have a lot of numbers in them. And so you might want to come back and look at them closer. And you'll be able to do that by printing or opening up the slides. All right, so let us begin and think, why are we even having this conversation? Why are we specifically looking at church buildings and talking about possible development, redevelopment of maybe some of them, and property? Before we do that, I will say where my experience comes from and why I'm sharing this. I've been the Associate Secretary for Stewardship and Planned Giving since 2007. I started in the stewardship portfolio and in 2012, added the planned giving portfolio as we merged those departments together. Prior to that, I worked in communications for Presbyterian World Service and Development. So I've been around for quite a number of years now. And I've always been fascinated by numbers. And so that was one of the reasons we had a small building committee that has been looking at how can we resource and support congregations as they consider what to do with their buildings, as well as presbyteries as they look at the buildings that are in their areas. And I've always liked data. When I went to university, I studied international development studies. One of the things I loved about it, it was 50% science courses, 50% non-science courses. And I've been fascinated with numbers and what the stories they tell, but also with getting numbers and getting facts so that we can really make decisions based on some reality or something solid and tangible. Even as I recognize that numbers don't tell the whole story, that there's lots of qualitative data that we need to look at as well. When I am not at the PCC office or speaking or working with congregations, you can find me on my farm a couple of hours north of Toronto. I raised sheep for 24 years, or almost 20 years, and have recently just got into goats. So I have lots of illustrations for anyone wanting to talk about sheep and the goats. And I recently got married last Thanksgiving, so I'm very happy these days. Lots of smiles. Okay, so here we go. Why are we looking at buildings? Well, this is very much, and one of the reasons it's a subject that crosses, when we're at the national office, all the different sectors. So Canadian ministries, stewardship, ministry and church vocations, but we've got PCBC and we've got the General Assembly Office. We all found that we were touching on different issues related to buildings. And we know that this is an important resource that we have been gifted from past generations. It's a legacy that we have to steward. And in stewarding it, we are acting as the hands and feet of God. So this is not something that we look at. They aren't buildings that belong to any one person. They have been given in faith to God and to us to help steward and manage them. It's also important to know once they are gone, they are difficult to get back. It's very expensive to build buildings, and there's a lot of church buildings across Canada right now. They've influenced much the formation of our communities and people's lives. It's also important, and we talk about when we're looking at buildings, to recognize the role that buildings and that land and property has played in our colonial history and the churches and that. So we always have that in the back of our minds as well. But mostly we're looking at buildings is because of the important role they play in mission and ministry. And we want to see if there's ways that we can, they can enhance mission and ministry, and we can help support congregations as they look at the buildings to do this. And when we look at the role that they play in mission and ministry, we know, and I'm sure you could think, if I opened up the chat and we had long time, we could come up with a whole bunch of different things. Why buildings are important, why we value them. It's a space to worship, to grow, to learn together, and which shares and tells a story of God and the character of our faith. Lots of milestones happen there. We hear again and again people talking about the buildings. Oh, I was baptized. This is where I was baptized. I'll remember. This is where I was married. These are the where funerals happen. So many milestones often happen in buildings, and they contain the memories, stories, and history of the community and of the worshiping community. They also are important to help to serve the broader community, not just the congregation's mission and ministry as it serves the community, but by providing a space for community events and gatherings, providing affordable spaces for profits or small businesses, entrepreneurs to rent, and providing a place over the years of sanctuary for people who have really actually physically gone to church buildings to find sanctuary. So it's important. And this list can go on and on and on. And I know because you've come to this webinar that I don't need to explain to you how important buildings are and what we look for. It's also important to know they come with certain challenges or responsibilities. They can be expensive and take in both time and in money to run and maintain. Sometimes it can be difficult to adapt them to the changing needs that mission and ministry need in their community. And they may not be accessible to everyone in the community for a variety of different ways. There's the physical accessibility, or people don't feel intimidated in going into a building because of what it has meant in the past. They may contain stories of hurt and pain as well. And we also include in the discussion, what is their role, or what can their role be? What should the role be in our journey of healing and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people? And I am not going to answer all of these questions in this webinar. We're just going to talk about the results from the building survey and from this congregational risk assessment. But I thought it was good to ground it in these conversations and discussions that we're having, so that you know that this is all part of a larger piece of the pie. And I want to know there are a few other resources that you can look at. Last spring, we had a webinar as part of the Money Matters course that is posted online under the leadership webinars in the Money Matters section. And that was facilities and grounds as a missional resource. And the Reverend Kirk Summers from Trinity Presbyterian Church, York Mills, and Jim McDonald took us through all the different ways that buildings can be used to increase mission and ministry, and a whole bunch of things for considering when you're doing your building. So it's a really positive webinar, just over an hour, and great material in there. And the handouts, the slides are all available if you're looking for them. And then we also did a number of articles in the Connection newspaper in the fall of 2023. And we're planning on using both webinars and the newspaper to continue this conversation, to bring people together as we learn and journey through what are the new, or what are the new trends in buildings, what are ways that congregations may look or use them better. Okay, so that is the intro. And from there, let me just introduce you to the PCC building survey. So most of you, I think, hopefully were familiar. One person or a couple of people filled this out for your congregation. It had started just with a group who was sitting, as we were sitting around, we had lots of questions and realized we didn't have concrete data on buildings. And as we began to talk about it and investing some of our resources, we were like, well, what are the needs out there? Is this an issue? Are there very many congregations that are interested in looking at redevelopment of buildings, maintaining their buildings? What's the story that we have right now? So we sent the survey out. It took us actually about 6 months to develop the survey, going back and forth, asking the questions, and then getting it laid out and thinking about how the answers would come in and how we would collate them. And but we sent it out in the fall, and then after a few hitches where some people didn't get the invitation to participate in the survey, and then several emails following up with congregations we didn't have results from, we got around 650 replies to the survey, which is pretty good. When you look at survey statistics, we have about 750 congregations. So that's a fairly good return. Some of the questions we asked, we gathered information. Some of it was contact information for congregations who'd done building projects before, because we wanted to contact them. We could learn. Sometimes when congregations are considering going on a building project, they want to talk to somebody who has been through it themselves. But we also asked a few subjective questions. Well, many of the questions were a little bit subjective. But one of them was, where do you see the congregation in 3 to 5 years? And I thought this was interesting, just from someone who's worked in the church, national church offices for many years, that we had 4% who were considering dissolution or were already closed from the ones that we asked. We had 11% considering amalgamation or a new configuration of ministry. 14% who said they really didn't know in 3 to 5 years. But I found it was interesting that we had 25% who saw themselves growing and 46% who saw themselves similar to now. When I was presenting this at the Life and Mission Agency, I was asked if there were sort of tangible things we did because they said, well, that can be qualitative. Were there any quantitative? This was really just a subjective question just to give us a feeling, because people's perception, I think, is also important of where they are. And so it just gives us an idea that I think the church, there's a healthy combination of churches who are doing well and who are growing, and then some who are looking at changes. We then also looked at how is your property currently being used? And again, this will be subjective, but the questions we asked for, there was about 2% of congregations who said the property, the buildings was maxed out. It was used most days and they are struggling to find the space. 32% thought it was efficiently used, well to serve ministry in the community. And then I thought it was interesting that about 66% thought it was moderately used and could be better used to serve mission and ministry, or it was underused, only for Sunday services and a few special events. So it did share with us a little bit. That could be something that we could continue to provide support for congregations and education about how their buildings may better serve their community and their mission and ministry. So that I wasn't surprised by these statistics from my visits with congregations, but I thought it was interesting. All right, and then we asked if congregations were interested in pursuing development into the future. We wasn't too surprised by these results either, that there was about 2% who started, got stuck, and would appreciate help in moving forward. 5% who said development was definitely part of their longer term plans, looking 5 to 10 years in the future. 13%, we kind of asked, it was interesting, we asked kind of two negative questions. One was, we're too exhausted and don't have the resources even to consider pursuing a development project. And one that is, we're not interested in pursuing a development project at this time. And that could be for a variety of reasons. So we had 13% who just were too exhausted, don't have the resources, and 65% who were not interested in pursuing. But then we had 15%. So I thought, okay, 15% plus the 2% and the 5%, there's a considerable number of congregations who are considering some type of development or change to their buildings. So, and when we have heard, and this is anecdotal more, and we've talked to ones that have gone through an extensive building project, they've said, oh, we really wish that we could have learned some best practices, that we could be sharing some resources and learn from one another. And this is not unique just to Presbyterian congregations. We've been having conversations with our ecumenical partners as well, the United Church and the Anglican Church, as well as a few others. And it's a very similar story. And many of the experiences, no matter what denomination you belong to, the case studies, some of the lessons and the best practices can be shared across denominationally. So we're not just having this conversation within ourselves, but we're also looking at resources produced by other denominations and seeing how we can be most efficient and not reinvent the wheel. So the thing that was really interesting is that I'd say now a year ago, I guess, I went to CREEF. It was in April, and we were talking about buildings and looking at it. And it often comes up, one of the things that comes up is all of these church buildings and how many have closed over the recent years. They quoted a figure at that time that in the past 10 years, there have been over 4,500 congregations across Canada of all denominations that have closed and shut their doors. And so many denominations are beginning to grapple with, well, how can we support our congregations? And we know that these resources, once they are lost, they are lost. And so are there ways, other than having them just sold and turned into restaurants and theaters and galleries, are there other things that could be done with this building resource? When it is good to know in the PCC, when a building is sold, the money from the sale of the building does go back into ministry, both through the presbytery. Most of the funds provide to the presbytery and go to funds available at the denomination that congregations and or presbyteries can apply for. So the money from the sale of congregations is reinvested back into mission and ministry. But still, the question that came up, is there ways that the buildings as a resource could be better used to serve the social good, to serve the community, and or to serve mission ministry and help us as we move forward and say, how, as the Presbyterian Church and congregations, do we serve? So we began to have a conversation. I met Mike Wood-Daly, and he had done this interesting study about the sort of risk of congregations closing in the future. And so we asked him if he would look at that with Presbyterian congregations. And then when we did the building survey, we said, well, what happens if we take that data that he has together with the building survey data and began to merge it? Is there any other lessons or trends that we can see that might help presbyteries and congregations as they're looking at the resources within their bounds? So I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and he's going to talk to you about the work that he does and what he has seen with congregations and the risk of closure in 3 to 5 years. And then we'll come back with what are the next steps for the PCC, where are we going? And then the Q&A, which is really important because I want to hear back from you. Because as we go and roll this information out more, we continue, the feedback we got from Life and Mission Agency and Assembly Council continues to inform us as we consider how do we deal with this information and how do we share it. All right, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Karen. And it's great to be with all of you this afternoon. I'm coming to you from Toronto this afternoon. And just wanted to, you can go back to the last slide just for a minute, Karen. Just to piggyback on your interest in numbers, I just want to highlight that numbers are big for me too. And the reason they're big for me is that I think those numbers can help fuel our imagination. And through the Halo Canada project and Sphere Research, assessments of congregations and with Trinity Centers Foundation, helping congregations put those numbers to use and helping them reimagine what they can do with their buildings and their properties to promote social good is really exciting for me. And I think Karen mentioned the importance of the buildings themselves and recognizing that faith communities are the second largest landholder in the country behind the federal government. It behooves us as religious groups and faith communities to look at what that means. So how we can leverage those assets to engage our communities, to be a spiritual resource in those communities and help promote the social good. And my background is I pastored for 10 years in the Baptist Church, but I do have some Presbyterian ties. I actually served a one-year interim ministry at St. Paul's Presbyterian in Hamilton. So we're not all foreign to me. Next slide. So we took a look at over 4,000 Canadian churches that had closed between 2009 and 2018 to get at some of this information. And what we were hoping to do is we figured that if churches were closing and we could take a look at their finances, we could take a snapshot of what a congregation was looking like before it closed. And then if we began to apply some of those numbers to active congregations, it would help give us some insights and maybe step in and provide some interim measures that can sort of turn that curve around and create some greater sustainability in congregations. I just saw something come out in the chat about the number of churches expected to close in the States. National Trust for Canada estimates that about a third of our churches in Canada are going to close this decade. So that would be roughly around 8,000 or 9,000 congregations. Not all of those have buildings, but they're pretty dire predictions. What we found from the churches that had closed was that typically they were showing an annual deficit for 3 or more years consecutively. Their annual expenses were running about 30% higher than their revenue. Cash and long-term investments, so essentially their piggy banks, were equaling less than 3 times their annual deficit. So if they were having to rely on those long-term investments to cover deficits, they really didn't have a lot to back themselves up and weren't giving themselves much opportunity for the future through reserves. Their occupancy costs, so things like utilities and maintenance, insurance, were totaling 30% or more of their annual expenses. And their staffing costs were greater than 60% of their total expense. Next slide. Important to remember when we look at some of these risk factors that financial factors aren't the only reason a church closes. It can be leadership reasons. It can be the state of the building. It could be demographic factors where people are moving out of rural centers to more urban centers. So not all factors as well were observed in every congregation that closed. We were just looking for sort of the greater number of those factors. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. But any of those factors can indicate some risk of potential closure. And what we looked at was typically if there were 3 or more of those factors that we talked about in the last slide present, that would suggest a high risk of closure within the next 3 to 5 years.
And Mike, when you looked at closure, it could be closed or amalgamated because
That's
they
right.
mostly they ceased to use the registered number, the CRA
That's
number.
right. Yeah. So there's a number of different ways a congregation's charitable registration can be closed. They can choose to do that and just close outright. They can indicate that they're closing to merge with another congregation. Some of the congregations were closed by audit from Canada Revenue. Some were closed because they simply failed to submit their T3010 charitable reporting.
Just a sec. There we go.
So here's the categories that we looked at in the financial data that comes from Canada Revenue, and this is all publicly available information. You can see on the left-hand side, we had the revenue and asset information, and on the right-hand side, the expense information. And here, and I should, if you notice the numbers there at the top, 2016 to 2019, we originally applied that up to the financial data for 2020. But recognizing that COVID began in 2020, that kind of skewed the information. And then, of course, 21 and 22 also had, some problematic reporting around that, congregations that would not be at their optimum level in terms of revenue and or their expenses either, recognizing that their programs might have been limited or suspended during that period. So we tried to look at something that was a little bit more typical. So that's the period that we looked at. So you can see categories there, and then moving across, and I won't go through all of the numbers. Again, as Karen mentioned, you can look at those later, but the average reported values during that time for those income and liability numbers. Some of the things that we were really trying to look at was how whether these numbers were increasing or declining. And you can see that like in that first column, we're looking at percent of change. We're looking at declines of greater than 30%, whether they were declining every year. We did look at the percentage of change in that first year of COVID and whether those numbers were declining. And then again in the expense categories. And we'll do some summaries of this later, but just wanted to show you the kinds of ways in which we were looking at the numbers. Slide. In terms of revenue, relative to many other mainline denominations, your denomination showed a relatively stable to positive financial picture overall. When you look at all of the congregations that we were looking at the reporting for, the cash and short-term investments rose by about 51%. The long-term investments increased by about 20%. The average overall revenue per congregation remained probably about the same, around a little over 200,000. And that was about 20,000, just a little over 20,000 of your annual expenses. So that was when we looked at all of the numbers together. Uh, while performing well overall, we're 21% of the congregation, so just around 160 that saw their cash and short-term investments decline by more than 30%. 9% saw the value of their charitable receipts decline more than 30%. 11% saw total assets decline more than 30%, and 10% saw total revenues decline by more than 30%. So, if we're just looking at kind of an illustration around what's happening there, it's a little bit like what we've been seeing in society overall, where the middle class is struggling. Those that are doing well, and that they're typically the upper class are finding better ways to manage during difficult times, and the poor are really struggling, and the middle class seems to be disappearing. And so we're seeing that in church finances as well. Again, if we look at expenses, a little over half of PCC churches saw occupancy costs increase more than 30%. 60% saw their management and administration costs rise more than 30%. 15% saw compensation costs increase every year. 12% saw their total expenses increase, and 19% saw their total expenses increase by more than 30%. And in that first year of COVID, there were close to 30% who saw a decline in their cash and short-term investments. 70%, so that's a pretty big number, saw a decline in their receipted charitable donations. 18% saw their occupancy costs increase, despite increased revenue and despite typically a suspension of programs. So increased heating costs, insurance, those kinds of things. And again, about 70% saw a decline in their total revenues. 20% saw an increase in their total expenses. So when we look at risk factors here, we look at the numbers and the percentages that were responding in those, or that we were observing in those different categories. We saw about 4% of your congregations that had a high risk, so and 15% that were moderate. So if we look at the number of congregations and the percentages down in that bottom chart, you can also see the number of congregations that were attached to that. I think it's important to recognize that about 80% are showing low to no apparent financial risk of closure. That's a pretty positive. I know that it's a lot of talk about decline in the church, and it's certainly something that we need to be focusing on. But in your situation, and it's better than many other denominations, that roughly about 19% are showing a high to moderate risk of closure. Again, remember, it's just on their finances. Those are not the only factors that contribute to it. And there you see that those percentages again in a pie chart.
So then we entered into phase 2. This was the phase 1 when we first began talking with Mike, and we entered into phase 2 where we introduced some of the information from the building survey data, as well as some information from the PCC statistical data to look at this. And here's what we found. Go on, Mike. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. So this is adding information with respect to attendance and capacity, building condition and use, the degree of interest, and the readiness for property development. And so we were trying to marry the information from that first study with what churches were saying in these different areas. And so, as Karen mentioned earlier, there were about 630 responses, and we had 611 matches to the previous survey. And then we used this, we applied the 3010 report. And from what we found in that, just as sort of an executive summary, we had 20 congregations at high risk of closure, 89 at moderate risk, 190 at low risk, and 312 not at risk. Next slide. So there's those numbers again. So again, here's a lot of numbers, and I'm not going to go through all of them again. But what we did, you can see, if you look at the top row there, we're looking at no risk through to high risk, and then all of the churches that were included in the study. We looked at average assets, and you can see if you go across that line of average assets, you'll see the kinds of trends that we were looking for or that emerged when we looked at the information. So for example, no risk congregations had about 1.3 million in average assets. Congregations that were at low risk had about 1.2 and a half. And so not different between the no risk and the low risk. And it dropped significantly once we moved to medium risk congregations. They had much less, typically they had much lower assets. And then again, moving into the high risk congregations, you can see again the drop in the average there. So hot, no, and low risk congregations were above the average of all of the churches, and the medium and high risk congregations were falling significantly below the overall average. And then you can look again at a similar pattern with liabilities. Congregations that are at no risk tend to have high liabilities, but they also have much larger assets and revenues and go along with that. Moving across, you can see again difference in expenses. So we're looking at high risk churches typically tend to be churches with smaller assets. They've got smaller revenues, smaller expenses. You can see the deficits, surplus and the deficits that go along with that. Then what we tried to do as well is to match them in terms of location, whether they were urban and rural congregations. The numbers, as we move towards the bottom, the halo value is a measure of their social impact on society, and that's based on some related research that I've done through the Halo Canada project. So those numbers are based on averages from more than 100 congregations across the country, and we simply applied those to the values that were being reported by the Presbyterian congregations. So those are not independent studies in congregations, but applied averages. And you can see there that typically rural congregations are, if we can just go back just for a second, and we see the rural congregations typically have about $600,000 worth of social impact in a congregation that has no risk, and a church that's at higher risk of closure, just a little over 200,000. And those ratios are kind of consistent across the categories for urban and then overall congregations. Typically, a congregation, what we're finding in those national studies is that for every congregation, or for every dollar a congregation invests, they're producing about $3.40 worth of social value. Next slide. So this looked at how, again, how congregations are seeing themselves as they move forward over the next 3 to 7 years. And we tried to match that with what their finance were saying about their risk. So congregations were showing no risk. About 40% of themselves saw themselves as similar to now. 30% saw themselves as growing. 13% saw themselves considering amalgamation or some new form of configuration of ministry. And then 3% considering solution or closing, and 14% not knowing. When we looked at the high-risk congregations, interestingly, those 45% of those high-risk congregations still saw themselves in that position 3 to 7 years from now. 20% saw themselves as growing, and then you can see the remainder of the figures there. So focusing, for the Presbyterian denomination, attention, medium to high-risk congregations that are growing, that have internal capacity and are considering amalgamation or closing, making their property available for sale and investment or assets or redevelopment of social impact. Next slide, please. Here we looked at the types of communities the congregations was serving, and this was kind of identified self-identified by the congregations, whether they saw themselves in rural situations or kind of a rural suburban setting, rural suburban city. So many of these congregations define those distinctions based on where their members were coming from rather than simply where they were located. And I won't go through all the numbers there, but you can see that's breaking down, and just the summary at the bottom. So rural sites are likely to have lower property values, limit their development capacity. They're also likely to have property values of urban and suburban sites are more likely to enable greater density, higher value fields, inclusion of community services, and higher social impact. Next slide. We looked at distinctions related to attendance and seating capacity. In no-risk churches, we saw that basically there, across the board at the top, the average seating tended to be about the same. The maximum seating, we saw a much larger difference. So no-risk congregations tended to have a much higher maximum seating. Average attendance, you can see, drops off significantly. So, and I want to draw attention to that average attendance at 52. You know, sort of a no-risk churches, even that's a pretty low number. So on average, we're dealing with really low attendance rates here across the board. But you can see in high-risk congregations, average attendance of only about 17 people. And so recognizing that, you know, their reliance on offerings to support their expenses is going to be pretty challenging. So congregations with average attendance of less, slide again, sorry, average attendance of less than 20% of capacity, far more likely to be at high or medium risk of closure. That's that bottom line there.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting one because when we used to do stewards by design and look at sort of stewardship issues, the feeling that there's not very many, you know, a congregation that has 30 people in it and it's only designed to hold 100 versus a congregation that has 30 people in it and it's designed to hold 1,200 feels very different, as well as the expenses probably being quite different.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah.
We looked at heritage factors, whether a congregation had a heritage designation, how parking space influenced their risk or how it was related to that, and what their potential development was. So you can see congregations there that had 30 or more parking spaces, and then congregations that had development inquiries. So congregations that were at no risk had about 13% of them had inquiries, 17% in low risk, 18% in medium risk, and 10% in high risk. And then we looked at those that had some sort of potential barriers to development that involved heritage or zoning. And again, you can see the numbers. So congregations with more than 30 parking spaces are likely to have enough property to be able to support some type of development, whether it's in addition to the church building itself or to develop the property independently beside the church. Previous inquiries by developers may suggest that there is significant development capacity. They're not likely to be asking if they don't think there's potential for making some money there. And again, the heritage or zoning restrictions may limit development capacity, but they don't, it's important to note that they don't always present insurmountable development challenges. Municipalities are increasingly recognizing the third space value of churches to communities, and that they may be able to make some accommodations that take into account the heritage classifications or zoning, and allow you to create some sort of partner development on the site.
It's a good question that had popped out. When we're talking about development, what exactly do we mean for development?
I think it can be a number of different things. It could be reconfiguring the space that you already have. It could be making an addition to your building. It could be development beside the building on the church property, could be demolishing the whole thing and developing an entire new site that could involve housing. It could be looking at the idea of a community hub where you're creating new space for partner agencies in the community to provide community and even faith-focused services. So you could be creating more space for your own service delivery and partnering with other organizations. But it's a pretty broad envelope that could fall into what development looks like.
Mm-hmm. But it's sort of doing something to try and address the needs of your community and the needs of your congregation to meet their needs as well. Something different and big, usually involving an investment of money and often a change to the physical space.
I think it's important to recognize that if if a congregation is looking at development, it's typically not a scenario where they have to put a lot of money into the project. Through Trinity Centers Foundation, when we're working with congregations, we're encouraging them to explore something that's called a joint venture partnership, where a developer will come in on your behalf and you work out with the developer what you'd like to do on the property. They work out the pro forma. So whether it's residential or partnering with other community groups, they say, this is what we can build for this amount of cost, and this is how money is going to come in to support that. And then we split the revenues based on whatever the development looks like. So what congregations are putting into the project is their land or a portion of their building. And they get out of that the return of actually developing property. It's not an investment of cash initially, it's an investment of your land and then leveraging those assets to get a return from it. Again, building condition uses and current uses. I won't go through those numbers, but you can see how churches were considering how their buildings are at present and how they're currently being used. And I think numbers that we had earlier around looking at how they can be better used. So congregations, if we go at that moderately used, could be better used to serve ministry and community, and then underused, those bottom two lines. You can see in no-risk churches, about 30% of them were saying they could be better used. Low-risk churches were over 60%, thinking that they could be better used. So a lot of work that we can be doing internally to reflect on how to use the space that we've already got better, and if we could be using it better through some minor alterations, or in some cases, some significant alterations to what that space looks like. And then I think that's, I don't know if this is the final question, but looking at excess property, whether congregations felt they had enough additional property that could be sold to support ministry and programming. Again, the numbers there. So underused buildings in poor condition could be strong candidates for reimagining or redevelopment. Buildings that are well used and in good condition may also represent good candidates, since good use and appropriate maintenance may suggest that the congregation has the kind of capacity that's needed to manage a project like that. And excess property which could be sold also likely represent congregations that could be good candidates for reimagined development of their property. So congregations that think they could be selling off a part of their property to simply gain some revenue, it may be better for you to consider partnered development on that property rather than just selling off the land. And the difference there is that if you just say a property is currently valued at, let's just for sake of argument, valued at $1 million, and you sell it off for $1 million, you get $1 million back. If the property is developed, value of that developed property could be $3 million. And so if you're splitting that with the developer, then you get $1.5 million back, or whatever the ratio, the split is based on the costs of developing. But usually if you stay in development and you're able to glean the benefit, the uplift of the development, you're going to get much more financial return. And then you can reinvest that into your programming and ministry. Looked at existing projects that were underway, again, that split of congregations where they're at risk or high risk, and some of the types of projects that are already in play and the number of units that are involved. And here we looked at interest in development, again, across the various risk categories. If we just look at the high risk column there, we saw that there are about 19 churches and 25% were interested in the possibility. 5% had plans to explore development. Fully half of them were not interested in any kind of development, and 20% were too exhausted to even look at the possibility. So when we looked at congregational interest in development, some of the observations coming out of that, churches are expressing interest in development will always represent a better development opportunity. I think it's like most of us, if we're more motivated to do something, the chance of us succeeding is higher. And so that's a factor to keep in mind. We want to note the correlation that churches with less risk are also more likely to express an interest in development. So while we may want to be working with churches that are at the highest risk of development, they may not have the resources to be able to participate in that. Building might not be in enough, well enough condition to even explore renovations, those kinds of things. And for the denomination to recognize that there are at least 8 congregations who have tried, were interested, they're still interested, and they're looking for help to re-engage in that process.
It's also interesting, some of the high risk ones, if there were ones that were potential for redevelopment or stuff there, that might be ones that the presbytery may want to look into and consider about. It would need external support as opposed to something that's coming from internally in the congregation.
Yeah. Readiness for development. I think it's important to recognize that interest in development is not the same as readiness for development. So there might be lots of congregations who are interested, but assessing how able they are to explore that is a different question. So we asked about their expressions of interest and how that might align with their mission. And, it's always dangerous, that last column, or question, our ministry is struggling and we think a project could help turn things around. Redevelopment of a site, renovations in a building is not a silver bullet for congregational growth or long-term sustainability. It can be a part of it. It's dangerous when we think it's the only solution to it. So recognizing that dynamic, it's important that a strong sense of shared mission, critical to that development success. So needs to, any exploration of development needs to kind of go out of an already established, embraced mission by the congregation, and caution around working with congregations who are exploring development out of inspiration. Some of the reasons for exploring development, the larger words there are those that appeared most often. So providing congregation, and I think the idea there being sustainability and long-term future of the congregation. Community was a big word, and sustainability. And there you can see the occurrences of those different words, exploring development. And then we did the same with asking how churches would, they would spend the revenue that would be generated by the development. And I think when we last presented to the commission, somebody noted the fact that minister appears pretty small there. So some of you who are ministers might have some concerns about that, but the ways that congregation were looking at spending the revenue were things like additional mission, outreach, providing support, putting money back into the building.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the occurrences of those words.
When I saw this as really very positive. because I saw that they were looking at redevelopment, or if they were to go in a redevelopment project, being about the mission and ministry of the church. The minister's salary often already supported by annual gifts and tithes and offerings, but this was really about the church, the congregation, having the ability to expand their impact in the community. So for me, this was a very hopeful slide.
So if we were looking at trying to create a profile of a congregation that would be suitable for development, or at least should be asking themselves about the possibility of development, these are the kinds of things that congregation might want to be looking for in itself, the denomination might want to be looking at. So again, things like this: expenses that are exceeding revenue by 30%, cash and long-term reserves total less than 3 times the deficit. They've been showing a deficit situation for 3 years or more in a row. Staff compensation is above 60% of the total. Occupancy costs are greater than 30% of the total revenue. Attendance is less than 17% of the seating capacity. We don't want to say 20% to average it off, but the highest and moderate risk categories were showing below 17%. Inquiries have already been made by a developer. The building is in poor condition, and Karen and I were talking about this earlier, and ideally we want to have the building in as best condition as possible in terms of the long-term vision of the property asset, recognizing that a building that's in really poor condition might say, well, we can't continue to function in this anymore, and we need to find a way to develop some new space. Recognizing that the building is underused, statistics are saying that church buildings are used only 5% of the time across the country. So thinking about how your space is being used by day throughout the week, and not just on Sundays. A congregation that has extra property that could be sold is a good candidate for exploring development, and a congregation that has interest in doing that, and recognizing that there's significant community returns that can be gleaned if something the congregation wants to consider.
And this isn't to say that any congregation in those no risk or growing congregations couldn't also consider development to support their mission and ministry. But this was particularly, as we look at a denomination and as presbyteries look at their congregations, it's important to know a congregation with this may very well or probably would need external support in order to go under a development project. And so that's something that would be considered. And it's kind of like, these are ones that we are at risk of losing that property building resource that may or may not be used in mission and ministry. Again, the first part is always that there's a vision of serving and participating in God's mission. That is always the most important for building. We're not in the job or business of making money off of the property resources of the church.
As Karen mentioned, I think this profile is intended to recognize that for the most part, we don't want to lose the assets that we have. And if we can step in early enough to preserve those assets, these are some of the warning signs that we want to be looking for to make sure that we don't lose those assets and the leverage of those assets unnecessarily.
Yeah, that's exactly. Thanks, Mike.
So some conclusions and recommendations from the denominational and the presbytery or the presbytery's point of views. Focus on the medium high risk congregations. Are there congregations there within your particular constituency that deserve some attention? Sorry, can we go back to the last slide?
Sorry.
Prioritize churches that are at medium to high risk, still have internal capacity, are perhaps experiencing growth, considering options such as amalgamation or closure for property availability and investment. So for those congregations that are Perhaps looking at closing, what does it mean to have extra asset? Does it just get sold off? Does the denomination or the presbytery want to use that as an additional ministry resource, even if there's not a worshiping congregation within that space? Does it look like a space that could be developed for housing or some other community asset? Secondly, consider property values in rural versus urban or suburban sites. Rural sites may have lower property values, limiting their development capacity, while urban and suburban sites are more likely to support higher density, yield greater value, and have potential for community service, inclusion, and social impacts. A lot of that based on access to programming, transportation, those kinds of things. Attendance capacity and risk of closure. Congregations with an average attendance below 20% of capacity are more likely to be at high or medium risk of closure. Parking space is an indicator. So those congregations that have more than 30 parking spaces, what could we do with that space as opposed to just parking cars on them, or having space to park cars, people that we have attending right now? Previous developer inquiries, again, shows interest and capacity and potential. What are the heritage and zoning restrictions? Don't be too discouraged if there are those. There's certainly still some reason to explore, but it could add some or limit some of the development capacity on the site. Look at the building condition. Underused buildings in poor condition are likely candidates for redevelopment, but well-used and well-maintained buildings may also be suitable, again, indicating the capacity to manage and develop the project, and the excess property and expressions of interest. So churches with excess property, it's available for sale. Churches that are expressing interest in development or actively seeking help for re-engagement are strong candidates. And then just remember, there's all sorts of red flags that go up when you're dealing with congregations that are exploring development out of desperation. So there are some situations in which it may be too difficult to create a sustainable model for a congregation in their current setting, and might need to explore something outside of development for that property and for the congregation.
Yeah, and it's also important, there's, as we saw earlier, lots of different motivations for development, some to provide a source of income. We've seen other congregations who have decided that they want to address, for example, the affordable housing crisis by using their resource, and it's not necessarily providing a new source of income for the congregation, but it's serving the community by providing a space for housing. We have been seeing that it's hard, but it may not be impossible to address both affordable or deeply affordable housing needs and providing a revenue stream for congregations. So they have to look at and consider all of those different assets.
So again, with some recommendations, we'd encourage the denomination and the presbyteries to consider a number of competing factors when discerning for how much to invest in assisting congregations in the development process. So those questions about medium to high risk congregations, what, as Karen mentioned, what are the financial yields, and is that a priority for the congregation or the presbytery? What is the current social impact? What's the potential degree of added social impact? What's happening in the neighborhood? Is it an aging community? Is there an influx of new Canadians? Are there lots of young families? Is it full of university students? How does that influence your discussions around what to do with your property? Is your congregation interested in doing it? You might have the potential to develop your property, but are you really interested in doing that? And are there interests in the community of partner groups that might want to participate with you in that? So what is your internal capacity? What's your readiness to move forward with the development plan? And so I think those are all factors that the denominational level at varying levels need to be considered.
All right, we are getting close to our Q&A time, and there have been questions that have been lining up, so I do hang in there. This is just to let you know, where do we go from here? We've been doing these studies. We wanted to get the information out there. We wanted to start to get feedback from congregations, and then we're intending to provide this information to both presbyteries and congregations. As you can see, depending on your viewpoint, you'll come at it from different things. So some of it is just to know congregations, oh, where do we fall in this? Do we have any red flags or things that we need to be addressing? I know often I've heard congregations ask me, how do you know when we're at risk of closing, or how long can we continue to go if we see these patterns? So we definitely want to get this information out to you and get it used. I know presbyteries will be interested in the details in their congregations, looking at and seeing who are the high risk congregations, the medium, the low, and then see from the information they have if these data lines up, this data lines up with what they know about the congregation. So our plan is to do that. We want to continue to gather and disseminate more information from congregations who've done developments from different denominations, because sometimes that is, and sharing case studies for inspiration. There was an event in Vancouver in March, and a number of Presbyterian congregations were there looking at reimagining church buildings, and we're planning to have another one in May 2025 in Ontario, and then they hope to have one in the East, in the Maritimes in 2026, where case studies and networking opportunities are provided. Identifying funding is also on the agenda, and that can be anything from internal funding, what funds from the PCC are available from this, but also external funding. How can you work with partners? What information can we provide for congregations looking to partner with people or organizations or agencies or the government that align with their mission priorities? So if it's to provide affordable housing and help address the affordable housing crisis, what can CMHC provide? And we're having conversations with the government at various ecumenical levels as well, because they are this is high on their agenda, and they have seen and know the potential of congregations and are interested in partnership. And then we hope to support ongoing conversations to draw together the congregations who are interested in development, perhaps establish some learning groups where we bring experts in and share experiences and continue to learn together and feel like we're not in this alone. So that's where the denomination is, and the different areas that we see we're working with. It's fluid. It continues to evolve as we get input from congregations. The contact information is here for you. I hope that you all know how to contact me. I'm always happy to work with congregations and help make connections. And then we also have the contact information for Mike. He is a researcher, knows this data. And if you ever were looking for someone to dive even deeper in your region or congregation, he is available and knows that. So, or if you've got questions that you want to ask him or talk to him. Again, this webinar will be posted at presbyterian.ca, the leadership webinars section. It does take us usually 2 to 3 days to get it posted. So the latest, we will try to get it posted by Monday, or if we can do it earlier, we will try. All right, yay, here we are. Time for the questions, the Q&A. So a reminder to raise your hand if you want to speak, and we'll unmute you, and then you unmute yourself, sorry, when you're called upon. But first, I'm going to get Maggie to walk us through some of the questions that have come in online.
Sure.
Oops.
There are questions about closing churches. So are there attendance statistics for these closing churches? And the second one is, do we know if they have children in Sunday school or if they have baptisms?
That would be I don't know whether you looked at attendance when you were doing your larger study of the 4,500 churches, Mike. That question came in before we started to talk about attendance at the PCC. And you can see that when we looked at the data, it wasn't the particular number of people that were important, but the seating capacity. So the sort of the ratio of the number of people that you had attending versus the seating capacity that told a little bit more broad a story. So you may have Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
And the closure data that we had from Canada Revenue did not have attendance figures. So all we had was the financial information.
Mhm. So when we introduced the attendance figures, we haven't introduced the baptisms or the number of children. We do have those figures in our statistical reports. So that might be something, if there's interest in that, I could look at contracting Mike to do that and introduce that, and then we can report back to you. So I like that idea. I think it might be eye-opening for us. All right, so that. Mhm.
Yep. Can you scroll back to slide 32 about the halo values and how is that calculated?
I'll let you answer that, Mike. Oh, yeah. Oh, Mike, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I muted so that I could type and you weren't hearing my clicking in the response. So the halo values are based on about 47 different variables that are covering 6 different categories. So we're looking at impact on use of space outside of the church building, the impact of spending, the social influence of educational programs, and the ability of a congregation to attract people to a community and their spending while they're in the community. There are social safety net activities that produce social good. So things like supporting and sponsoring refugees and new Canadians, working to prevent incarceration, Alcoholics Anonymous programs. So, the number of different one-step programs, reducing social exclusion. So all those kinds of activities that have studies that say that if you involve these many people, or if you're doing this type of activity, and you are creating social good, and here is the value of that. So there's a number of different calculations that we can use for that. The other one is the social capacity that's generated by the building. So through sharing your space. So for example, we look at what the market value would be to rent out space. And if you're offering that space to community groups, whether it's guides or, for piano recitals or public performances, the difference between what you're charging and what the market value for that space is considered to be a social good. And then the volunteer time that is generated by church members and or people who are participating in activities that are being delivered out of your church. And that particular one is one that a lot of light bulbs go on for people. That Conference Board of Canada suggests that we can sort of apply $27 an hour for every volunteer hour. So that's across a broad range of volunteer activities. So when I mentioned before that $1 of investment, or $1 that the church spends, and creating social value of about $3.40, that's where those calculations come from. So if anybody wants more details around how that works and what it looks like in a particular congregational study, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to fill you in more on that.
And it was originally or often developed to talk to government about the value of congregations to communities, or to talk to different developers, government, different people, to see and appreciate that it's more than just the dollar figure of the congregation.
All right. So if you sell the building but keep the congregation, does the monies from the sale remain with the congregation?
So when amalgamation happens, the sale of the building, the funds go to the amalgamated congregation. They have to, plan, I believe, needs to be submitted to presbytery, and often 10 to 15% of the proceeds are encouraged to go to support mission outside the congregation.
But what about an active congregation that sells the building?
Oh, and an active congregation that sells the building, yes, they can still have control of the resources. So they may, a number of them, invest it and use the proceeds to help offset rental facilities or expenses wherever they're going. So yeah. I think they still have to present a plan and get it approved by presbytery.
All right. So another one about the risk factors. So did you connect a risk to reliance on the endowment fund? Meaning when you looked at revenue and deficit, did you see a risk about reliance on endowment fund versus the current year?
So what we looked at was whether the endowment funds that they currently had were less than 3 times the annual deficit. So that was one of the risk factors.
Correct. So what does it mean by the word leaving the denomination?
I'm trying to think of where that we didn't really talk about leaving the denomination, but if a congregation was to leave the denomination and applied for a new charitable registration number, in the statistics, it would look like the ministry had closed. So that would include churches that had left. That would also then be considered to be a church that had opened if you were looking at the broader things, because they would presumably get a new registration number and start as a new faith community.
So a question about the compensation costs. Is that the stipend and housing only, or is that the EI, CPP pension, health and dental, etc. included?
It includes all of those benefit costs.
It's and it's also it's all compensation, not just your minister. So it's for all the staff, because this is the question that's asked on the T3010, which applies to all the staff the church employs, not just the minister. So compensation for all staff.
All right. And do you have thoughts regarding rental revenue compared to offering and donations? Is there a significant ratio that indicates risk?
That's one actually Kirk Summers talked about in our other webinar about rental revenue. I don't think it necessarily corresponds to, and I'll let you answer this as well, to risk. The important thing is that if there's rental revenue, that it continues to go towards the mission and ministry of the church, so that it allows the church to expand its mission or ministry, that you're charging rent to groups that can pay for rent, and then you're providing maybe subsidized or affordable rent or space for ones that can't. So it's sort of, I think it was interesting when Kirk Summers presented, he said, you know, be sure to charge your market value if you're renting the church out for Elections Canada or something like that, for groups that can afford to pay it. And it's important about how that money goes back and flows into your mission and ministry. Mike, what do you think? What have you seen?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a relationship between the rental revenues and the like the offerings. But one of the things that we recommend with Trinity Centers Foundation when we're working with a congregation is if they can look towards having their rental revenues move towards equal with their operating expenses. So if you can say that you're using your tenants or we rather prefer you refer them to as your space partners rather than tenants, so that there's a real partnership. But if you look at those monies coming in, if they can cover things like your heating, your other utilities, your maintenance, things like insurance on the space, whether there's security costs, those kinds of things. If you can move towards balancing those two values, then you can put your other monies into supporting your ministry and programming. So if you make the building pay for itself through its rentals, and that reduces your risk.
Yeah. And I would say, putting my stewardship hat on, to remember that talking about stewardship, that giving of your part of the resources that God has given to you is all part of spiritual development and faith formation. So it's not to say that we're trying to create communities that are just self-sustaining without people contributing to it. That is part of our faith journey. So it's about, this can allow us to do more mission and ministry. And it's not to take the place of, oh, you can now come to our church and you don't need to worry about giving.
Okay. So a comment, it will be variable to determine if week-to-week attendance numbers are stable, increasing, or decreasing.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting, when Maggie and I met with the presbytery clerks, one of the things that they asked, and this was in the fall, is there things that we can do with the statistical reports that can tell us more about our congregations over time, year over year, versus just what's the annual numbers. So we are looking at what graphs we can provide and information, and it's still coming. But we're hoping to do that, because I do think that is helpful information for presbyteries and congregations to see where are they compared to previous years, and how has changes been happening over time.
I think too, just in terms of how attendance relates to your membership roles, and how many of the people who are on your roles are actively attending and actively contributing, and it's always a good exercise to review those roles and to be able to go to those people who are not attending and sort of explore their relationship with the congregation, because if we're reporting our membership roles, it often gives an inflated impression of how well we're doing, as opposed to and some of the financial factors.
Yeah, and it's also important to know that there have also been changes in the way people attend church. So you may find that right now usually our average attendance in worship is 50 people, but that may actually reflect 70 or 75 people who are active in the congregation, but they tend to come 1 or 2 Sundays a week, or a month, instead of every Sunday. So we do see changes there. So you have to always, this is why numbers, they can tell different stories. You have to know, you have to be able to say, what's the story going behind the numbers that we have? And does it line up with what we're seeing? So that's why I'm sort of excited for the next step. Well, we share the numbers with you and you start to look at your congregations and say, oh yeah, what are the stories we're seeing here?
There's also, since COVID, some very early studies that are suggesting that people who are attending virtually are not contributing to the same degree that other people who attend in person are, or from their previous giving when they were themselves attending in person.
Yep. I see we have one more question in the Q&A, and then we'll answer that, and then we'll see if anybody has a question that they want to ask verbally.
Okay. So from the figures mentioned, are they based on the CRA reports of 2019? If so, is there a difference to the 2022 or 2023 CRA reports? One is prior to COVID, the others is after.
The challenge is, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen.
I was going to say the challenge is that 2023 reports are still being filed. So you have until, was it June 15th? Is it June 15th? June 30th to get your 2030-10. So it's, with all of these numbers, you can't actually look at them until they're filed. And so we need to do that. But I think I can see us looking at these numbers again now once we have 2022 and 2023. Go ahead, Mike.
And even from CRA, the 2021 and 2022 numbers are not complete. So some of that's late reporting from congregations, and some of it is just CRA lagging behind in them updating the information. So the information that we did look at was 2016, 2020, and the risk factors were based on 2016 to 2019.
If anyone wants to, if you can see, if you want to speak and raise your hand, there is a raising the hand usually option. Yeah. Oh, okay, I just saw. Can you see it, Maggie?
No, I am not in the view.
Just a second. Participants, there we go. So, oh, there's. And if you can't figure out how to raise your hand and just want to unmute your mic.
Cheryl.
Oh, there we go. Sherry Inksetter.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just noticed in the chat that Lincoln said heard this may be up for discussion at General Assembly this year. And I could tell you in a broader sense, it will, I'm the convener of the Assembly Council, so I know what will happen-ish. And I could tell you that, yes, there will be this in a broader sense. We're going to be talking narratives of hope and possibility. And so this will, I'm sure, be part of the broader conversation. And we are hoping to have table groups to actually talk about this, because it's being talked about across the country. We know that. So we're hoping to have that time built in at General Assembly.
Great. And Miklos?
Thank you very much. Well, if I see well and understand well the picture that you showed us, in this case, in general, all the Christian churches have way much more assets for missions or to start something new outreach programs, or I don't know what, because of the money they can get from the closing churches. I think the Presbyterian Church in Canada has also assets already, and I think is going to grow rapidly in the future. Do you have any plan, or are you doing something to use this really large amount for very new or creative missionary purposes?
I mean, there's always, as assets come into the Presbyterian Church in Canada, there's always discussions at different levels how to best use them and how to invest them in both building new faith communities and evangelism and supporting our international partners and work around the world. So I don't know, that definitely is throughout the reports that go to General Assembly and is discussion. But yeah, they are looking at the resources and reserves that are in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I know the Finance Committee and the Assembly Council are continuing to do that and are looking forward to saying, what are we best using these resources and how are we best using them to participate in God's mission?
May I ask how much money we are talking about roughly?
Oh, I don't have that at my fingertips right now. I don't know if Sherry does or if Peter Bush does. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I have definitely kept you past the hour mark, and those of you who come to my webinars are not surprised by this. But thank you for participating with us and joining in the discussion. I hope that you will look at the numbers, you will look at the congregations, look at your congregation, and sometimes it just helps to say, whereabouts do we fall, and see that you're not in it alone, that there's many others who are sharing their journey, and look forward to working with presbyteries and working with individual congregations as we say how we can continue to be faithful and participate in God's mission together. Thank you for your interest in this and your questions as we've gone along, and we'll see you in a webinar, I'm sure, in the near future.
Hi, everyone.